Boker Tov, good morning everyone. Great to see you. Welcome to the 22nd Annual Yemei Iyun on Tanakh, Jewish Thought and Talmud in memory of Riva Kashitsky Zichronah Livracha. My name is Tully Harcsztark, and the topic of this shiur is developing a healthy relationship with the Yetzer Hara, psychological insights from the Yichud Sugya. If there are a couple of more, hope everybody's got a sheet, and I just want to give a little bit of background to where this is coming from. The Talmud track, I think here, is an outgrowth of a project that we've been working on. This is a Machon Siach, it's like an arm, a project of SAR High School, which is trying to give space to teachers to work on some large issues, questions that are important for us to work through that sometimes you don't have a chance to focus on in the day-to-day life of school as you're administering school with hundreds of kids. One of the projects that we've been working on is, we've kind of called it Making Sense, and it's a Gemara project, a Talmud project, and the idea where this is coming from is often there's, I'm going to ask actually that you have in mind as we're learning through this sugya to kind of do it on two levels. One is like the content itself, and on some level it's learning this content with a high school student in mind, because part of what this is about is how do we get kids to be able to think about Gemara in ways that when you're working it through, it's actually kind of bridging 2,000 year, 1,500 year divide across cultures to be able to have that sugya be meaningful in terms that we understand today. And that actually takes some work in order to achieve. Very often, my own learning of Gemara over the course of years, I'd learn something, arrive at some point in the Gemara and say, like, I don't understand this drasha, some kind of attribute it to, well, the Gemara does that, and then move on, slide through the lines. You should tell me if kind of this resonates in terms of like whether you understand that happens to you sometimes when you're learning Gemara. There are all kinds of things that happen. Why is the Gemara thinking about this? Why is it use this drasha? What's the difference if you use this drasha or that drasha when they're quoting the pasuk? Why does the Gemara ask this question? It doesn't seem like a question that matters. Very often, in my own learning over the course of years, I'd put those questions aside because the real thing was whatever the lamdos or conceptual thing was about. As a teacher, I find it really important, and it's one of those things that when you're thinking about 10th graders, kids are 15 years old and learning Gemara, it's like you should understand what's actually happening in the Gemara. So for me, that raised the question of how can I actually explain the Gemara itself in a way in which I'm not sliding through those lines. So that's what the larger project is about. And you feel like you can learn any Gemara, and if you really bang your head against the wall, sometimes you can't really figure it out, but often there's something that's being raised that's really relevant, not just important in the sense that everything in Torah is important. Of course, that's true, and knowing what the halacha is important. But on other levels, like psychological levels or things like that, it's also can be very important. So I've been teaching Kiddushin for a number of years in 10th grade, and we've had our set list of sugyot that we dealt with. At some point, in line with this kind of thinking, I said, well, at the end of Kiddushin, there is a long sugya on Yichud, and Yichud has to do is an Isur, which according to the Gemara Sanhedrin is an Isur Doraisa. According to the implication actually in this sugya is that might not be an Isur Doraisa. That is a machlokes rishonim at the end of the day. But it does have to do with, in the Gemara's discussion, a prohibition against a man and a woman being alone in a room, and it is about sexual drive and things like that. So just to put the question on the table, I can think about it. It's like I got 10th graders in a room. I'm learning Kiddushin. There is in this Masechet that we're learning a sugya that's like speaking straight to what's on kids' minds like all the time. But probably if I'm going to try to read that Gemara, it's going to be like talking about things that are going to sound outland, and far removed, and I can learn the halachas of Yichud. But is it actually like possible? Can we learn the Gemara itself and kind of get a sense of what it's saying in a way in which it would open up conversation that was really speaking to where kids are at and people are at? That was kind of the challenge. So what I'd like to do is, and I'm inviting you please to raise your hand if you have anything to say at any point. This is not like questions at the end kind of thing. I am going to try to do a number of pieces of the Gemara first kind of a little bit more frontally, although you can participate and ask anytime you want. And then at the end, the last part, there are a bunch of stories. The Sugya of Yichud ends with a number of stories where I'd like to try to work that through together if we can. So that's the challenge. Any clarification points just for right now? We're okay? Okay. So this is, we learned through a number of chunks of the Gemara. If you can take a look, source number 1 is a Mishnah. First line in a drop is the first part of the Mishnah in Kiddushin and Daf Pei Amud Bet. And that's the part I'd like to focus on. And the Mishnah starts as follows. This is where the Yichud discussion begins in Masechet Kiddushin. So the first line says, Lo yityacher adam im shtei nashim, aval isha achat mityachedet im shnei anashim. So first of all, the case that the Mishnah begins with is, there are kind of two cases that are paralleled between, the first is talking about a man with 2 women, and the second is talking about a woman with 2 men. And the Tanakama actually makes a distinction between those 2 cases. So the first thing that you note when you read the Mishnah is it doesn't actually start with the halach of Yichud. It actually starts like with a step 2 kind of question, not with a step 1 kind of statement. There is an issue of Yichud. Why is that true? That's obviously clear. Let's just take it like that. If I'm going to say it, why doesn't even need to say it? There's an issue of Yichud. Whoever's going to ask, where do you know there's an issue of Yichud? They'll talk about that. But they actually talk about another case. This case here actually is going to give some kind of insight as to how the Gemara is seeing the core of the Isur Yichud, where it stems from. And the Tanakhama says there's a difference between a man with 2 women and a woman with 2 men. There's an Isur of Yichud, Lo yitached adam im shtei nashim. The Isur of Yichud, when there is 1 man and 2 women, that's a problem. Aval isha achat mityachedet im shnei anashim. Rabbi Shimon omer, af ish echad mityached im shtei nashim. So what's Rabbi Shimon's opinion? Rabbi Shimon's opinion is it doesn't make a difference between the genders. It's all the same. If I just stopped here for a second, I actually will ask you to, what's the idea, what's the Mishnah communicating? It's actually not communicating that there is an Isur. It's almost like assuming that there's an Isur of Yichud. And I'm going to make the assumption that in the room here, most people would identify with Rabbi Shimon's opinion more than the Tanakama's opinion. Let's take Rabbi Shimon's opinion. What's Rabbi Shimon trying to say?
When there's more than 1 person, you're not worried.
When there's more than 1 person, it's not a problem. So why? And again, I'm going to ask you with all of this to keep like the 10th grader in mind. Although I have to say that what I find is, as somebody who's 10th grade was a lot of years ago, I find that when I learn the Gemara with the 10th grader in mind, I actually understand the Gemara much better than I did before and draw things out of it that's like, wow, that's really an important thing. What's the Mishnah saying? Yeah.
It's less intimate when there's more than 1 person.
And therefore?
That we're less worried about someone.
Because what's going to happen?
Yeah.
Meaning, what's the factor? So Rashi actually says, Im bet nashim. Do I have that Rashi? Sorry. If you see the Rashi, the next source, the second line says, Im shnei anashim. Rashi says, Sha'achad bosh mechavero. This is actually a very important and powerful idea that might, seem obvious on some level, but it's worth actually thinking about in real terms. What's the Gemara actually saying here? We're concerned about people's sexual drive, and the Mishnah is basically saying, if you have more than 1 person, then that's okay. There might be a difference between men and women. I'm actually leaving that to the side now. That's like hard to explain what the first opinion is. Maybe we'll talk about it, we'll see. But let's just talk about this. The Gemara, the Mishnah is actually making a really important assumption. What prevents people from doing an Aveira in this respect?
Embarrassment.
Shame. Yeah, shame actually is what's going to, being embarrassed is actually, the halacha is acknowledging that's what's going to stop somebody from doing the wrong thing. That is an important thing to consider actually, because then the Mishnah is really saying what isn't necessarily going to prevent you from doing the wrong thing. Knowing that that's the right thing to do, either because the halacha says it's the right thing to do, or because you have a Yetzer Tov and you should decide to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And what's this Mishnah really saying? You might not be able to do that. That might actually not work. That becomes a very big idea, because sometimes you'll say, if the only reason why I'm not doing something is because somebody else is around, but otherwise I might do that, then I'm obviously not such a great person. And you can imagine that kind of logic, right? That's a weakness in me. I'm not able to make a correct decision or restrain myself when nobody else is around. How can that be? And the Mishnah is basically saying, Chazal are saying, no, that's true. You can't assume people are going to do that. What you need is shame. And what we're going to see in the Gemara is part of what happens in the Gemara is you can construct situations where you're going to be embarrassed if something happens. But you can enter situations where you wouldn't be embarrassed if something happens. And that's actually how you have to think about that. I mean, that's going to make a difference. That opens up kind of a whole field. Like you have to almost put yourself in those situations where something like that is not going to occur. You got something to say? You look like you're thinking.
Yeah, no, so then the question becomes also, like, if you're with other people and that doesn't cause embarrassment, and then, like, are you violating Yichud in any shape or form?
Yeah.
And also, is there a difference between being with a friend? Is it dafka a friend, or is it just any other person?
Yeah.
Rashi said friend.
So what's interesting about that, maybe we'll go out of order since you segued to a different piece. Maybe I should take you up on that now. That's an interesting question. When you think about halacha, the Mishnah actually said the halacha. What's the halacha? 3 people are okay. Maybe there's a difference between men and women. That's the rule. What about 10 people? That's okay. Why is it okay? Because it's more than 3. 10 is more than 3, so therefore it's not a problem. Now, if you read, and this is, I think, really interesting, the following, I'm going to take your kind of lead and ask you, I'm going to go out of order. If you can turn the page to where it says number 3 on page 2. So this is about, this mission is on the top of Pei Amud Bet, and this is towards the bottom of Pei Amud Bet, and the Gemara says as follows. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Now, when you're teaching a Gemara class, right, in general, or to kids here again, there's a lot of things that are going on. Like there's a values thing, there's a halacha issue, and the thing that you're raising is, how do you think about halacha, which is supposed to be like, that's the rule. Rules are rules, but there's a reason for those rules, and then you're in a different circumstance where the rule would tell you one thing, but the reason for the rule would tell you something else. Like, how do you manage that? And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. So Rav Yehuda says the name of Rav, Lo shanu el biksherim, aval biprutzim afilu be'asara nami lo. So Rav says, what's the Mishnah talking about? Ksherim. What is ksherim? Say in a second. But what's the Mishnah not talking about? Prutzim. So what are ksherim and what are prutzim? So what's a porutz or prutza?
Promiscuous people?
Yeah, to be poretz literally means to break through, right? It's like if you have a fence, poretz geder, you break through, that's being poretz geder. A prutza or a porutz is somebody who the social guidelines, whatever the expectations are, you cross them. It's like a transgressive mindset. If you're supposed to do X, you'll do something else, doesn't matter. So what's Rav's rule? What's the Mishnah saying? The Mishnah said 3 is okay. What does Rav say? It's only talking about ksherim, but if the people are prutzim, you can have 10 people in a room and there's an Easter Yichud.
Which people? Referring to the 2 individuals, or referring to the other parties, like the other members?
Arguably, you need 2 to tango, so it's at least 2.
No, but let's say you're in a room of 10. Is it the 2 people that are violating Yichud, or is it the additional 8 that are with them in the room?
Okay, here's the thing. I would ask you the following question. Can you imagine a room where there are 10 people in the room and there's, think of the, what prevents Yichud being a problem? Shame. That's what the Mishnah said. So what happens? Can you imagine 10 people in a room where there's no shame?
Yes.
It's the best thing. Honestly, it's like, it is a great thing. I wait for all that. I love when this comes up. When I ask a room of high school kids, can you imagine when there are 10 people in a room where there's no shame regarding stuff like that? and they
Say yes.
yeah, it's like a
Of course.
yeah. Meaning that. Can I admit to it's? I feel like what I love about this is the Gemara is like at the core of what's actually happening for kids. They're like, I can't believe that the Gemara is actually like addressing something that happens like on a Saturday night when there are 10 people in a room, and what do you mean? There's no Isser Yichud? Yeah, Rav actually says there's an Isser Yichud. What do you mean there are 10 people in the room? No, that's the reason for the Isser Yichud. You violated the Isser Yichud having 10 people in the room. And they're like, wow, that actually makes total sense. I get like the logic of it, and that's like on that level. Then you got to stop and say 1 second, because when you learn Gemara, there's something else that kicks in. That's what Rav said. But what do you think about what Rav said?
I like what Ralph said.
From a values perspective. Like it. Okay. How about from an interpretive or legal perspective, Harriet?
Oh, well, I was just going back onto, in other words, if they're saying, yeah, I can see it, are they identifying with the Kshavim or with the Yitzhak? In terms of who they see themselves being and who the Gemara is addressing.
Oh, that's great. Hold that thought. We'll get to that. In a second. So Rav says, actually, meaning, yeah. Then one question is interested in we have to raise. I love that you said that too. That's a segue to the second half of this Gemara. But hold that for a second. It's basically saying, okay, if you're at that, is it okay to just like talk about you're at a party on Saturday night as a high schooler? Is that okay? If you're in that, can you be like, yeah, I'm a kosher? Is it about your own judgment about who you are? Like, how do you define that? That's one issue. We'll get to that in a second. There's actually a halachic issue.
One is saying that it's a statement. There's part of halacha which isn't like it's kosher, it's not kosher. Here, it's giving you the ability to kind of
Decide
where you stand.
Yeah.
And that doesn't sound very halachic.
Yeah, the Mishnah actually said something. What did Rav do? Was Rav in line with the Mishnah?
Maybe.
Can he do that? Actually, if you're thinking about it, it's like, can Rav do that? The Mishnah said 1, 2, 2 and 1, and Rav said, I think 10 is also a problem.
By the way, one could argue it also isn't sex related because there are other kinds of implications. I
What
can
if-
make the same case on drugs, on drinking.
Oh, sure.
on
Yes.
any-
Yes. It is true, and we should note that that the Isser of Yichud it's clearly, the Gemara in Sanhedrin uses as the source for Yichud. It quotes the source of the Gemaras we're going to see in a couple of minutes, but it uses Amnon and Tamar as a reason for it being an Isser D'oraisa. The reason why that is important is because when you're learning Hilchot Yichud and you ask, why are there Hilchos Yichud? What are you trying to prevent by having Hilchot Yichud? I don't know what your gut assumption is in terms of like, what do we want to make sure it doesn't happen? If the source is Amnon and Tamar, non-consensual, if you're afraid about like a rape.
Me too.
Me too, yeah. Which actually, just to take that, this is a Gemara, like, no, our whole planet, right, is the past bunch of years has been like the issues of consent. You go to a college campus now, and the first thing that they're going to talk about, you're going to have a whole session on issues of consent. So Yichud is actually about, according to that, it's actually about two things. You can see it clearly from different sources. On one level, there's a concern about non-consensual sex. On another level, there's a concern about it's consensual, but in an intimate setting, you're going to lose, right? The busha is supposed to prevent that from happening. So all these things are speaking to, like, if you think about it in the right way, I guess this might seem obvious, like when you're reading the Gemara, it's like, yeah, that's what the Gemara is saying. I feel like I've learned through like these Gemaras and gone straight to Hilchos Yichud without actually like paying attention to what's going on in the Gemara. There's a move here, for example, that's really big, saying like you can have Yichud when there's a whole group of people. I just want to know. Well, yes, go. No.
So it's just interesting because the non-consensual part of it does not seem to be taken into consideration with the 2 and 1. Because 2 guys and a girl is okay, according to whoever said that, but 2 girls and a guy isn't.
Yeah.
Typically, non-consensual will be much more likely 2 guys and a girl.
We need to explain that, and that, I think, it's going to be hard to explain. I think there is an explanation that is not contemporary exactly, but might be in a certain respect. but maybe I'll circle back to that. Hopefully we get back to earlier sources. Yeah.
Wouldn't it maybe be a reason for why it's okay for two guys and a girl and not, no, if it's okay, if it's two girls and a guy, but not two girls, two boys.
Two men and
Two
yeah,
men
is
and
not
a
okay. According to the Tanakhama, yeah.
Kind of because of like how a man can have two wives, but a woman can't have two husbands.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. Is that related, right? Is it relevant that, having more than one wife is permitted according to halacha? It's an interesting thought. I'll ask when you come back, yeah.
As you alluded to, the other interesting part is the ksherim and prutzim, because while the Gemara is focused on yichud, the implication of ksherim and prutzim can affect your whole life. In terms of it can affect your business, it can affect your relationships, it can reflect all kinds of other, if you're hanging out with Hasidim, your likelihood of keeping the mitzvot and doing things and living a certain life. So while the focus is on yichud, the interesting discussion is the greater implications about this notion about who you're spending your time with, which has implications on your whole life.
And that totally comes up in a discussion, meaning what this is saying is who you decide is going to be your group is going to make a difference. Actually makes, according to Rav, a halachic difference in the context of yichud, because it makes a difference in terms of decisions that you make and things that you do. And when you do that, and reading that in the Gemara, it's like nobody can argue with that. It's like, that's
So what do the
true.
kids say in that discussion?
I think that they're
Are they just
kind of
sitting
honest
there?
about the discussion. At the end of the day, I find like largely it is counterintuitive to me, again, reading the Gemara, but largely they are surprised to find, it doesn't mean that tomorrow they behave differently, but they are surprised to find that the Gemara is actually talking really straight to where they're at. And it also is comforting in certain respects. It's like, sometimes it's hard for me to choose a friend group. Well, actually, Gemara something like that actually matters. Sometimes it's hard for me, or I see it as a weakness when I think about like shame. Well, Gemara actually thinks that you need to put yourself in context where there's going to be some kind of shame. I thought this is on, but it seems like it's not. Not sure why. And try it again. Yes, Andy. Sorry. Did I call you Andy?
Yeah.
I do that all the time.
I think that, or I appreciate anyway, that the second Gemara I think adds an interesting qualification to the ethos of the first Gemara, which is that I feel like something you hinted to at the beginning, maybe we get to it at some point, is that like the way that we explain the Yichud, the three people situation is not that people will control themselves because of halacha and like an independent commitment, a rational commitment to what they think is right or wrong, but because of push or whatever. And in some ways, there's like a powerful, maybe even healthy, like validation of our base instincts there.
Yes.
But somebody might plausibly take that too far, and so you sort of like remove yourself from all culpability there and say, like, oh, it's like what, I am an animal in some ways, and that's what happens, and that's what I do. And so like, yeah, like Pusha will prevent me, but like that's who I am, and it's okay. And I think like there's something interesting here. We're saying, oh, like hold on, like that might be true, but if you're the type of person who's in the Britzim category, like you like can't really be in public.
That's well.
I mean that's sort of an exaggerated sense.
Right.
Like,
Like, I think it's like I understand why the Gemara has these kinds of rules in place. It makes sense to me, and then I have to imagine if you don't want to take them seriously, that's your choice. But it is. But kind of is what it is. I want to one more, and then sorry, I just want to be able to kind of move through a little bit more, cover a little bit more of this. Yes.
So there's some people said, how do you define if you personally are a kosher or a parts? Because I never liked that story with the rabbi sitting outside the mikveh and saying like,
Yeah.
I'm pure.
Yeah.
I'm pure, it's okay, I can do that.
Oh.
You
I love that story. But yes,
I'll be like,
no, only because of what you said before. I think that the subjectivity thing is really interesting. Hold on, we're going to see a story in a second. I do want to point out, I think it's important to note that the Gemara is actually bothered, and the Gemara does this in different places. Rav is, I love Rav. And basically, he does things like this all the time. He just says, this is how I think this should be. The Gemara's like, you can't, how can you just do that? So the Gemara then says a couple of things. First it says, have a ma'aseh, at the end of that first line, you're still in the same place, got the place. Have a ma'aseh v'otziu asara b'mitah. Okay, this drives kids crazy. The Gemara doesn't want to say. It says there was a story where 10 people took her out in a bed. Rashi has to describe what the story is, but it's basically some kind of problematic sexual thing, and orgy-like, and the Gemara can't believe, kids how's the Gemara talking about this? And that's also a discussion. Do you like that actually the Gemara is this the first time you've heard about something like this? No. Does it bother you that the Gemara is talking about this? Yeah, it really does. Well, why? And after a little discussion, it's like, I think the best thing about the Gemara, not the best thing, a great thing about the Gemara is that it actually is, it's not unaware of these things, it actually is related to it. I'm going to leave that to the side. Now the Gemara is bothered, because I want to, so Rav Yosef, who comes after Rav, he's like trying to find some kind of basis for it. He says, Amar Rav Yosef, Teda, de mechabri be'asara ve'ganvi kishura v'lo michsefi me'hadadi. This is Joe's point here. Rav Yosef says, are you so surprised by this? Teda, you know, the Machabri Be'asara, 10 people, I call it, this is like an Ocean's 10 reference here, if you've seen those movies. 10 people can get together, Viganvi Kshura, they can steal like lumber, they're not embarrassing each other. It's like, are you so surprised about this? Rav's not giving such a chiddush because people who join together to steal, do all kinds of other criminal acts. That's what's happening here. And I actually, on the question of how do you source this, the Gemara then tries to find a proof in the Mishnah, which I actually left out in the interest of time. But the Gemara is like, how did Rav do that? And tries to find a source from a Mishnah, then it doesn't really work out. But that's also another layer in terms of how innovation, change, like how you take a rule in the Mishnah, how the Amora, and deal with straight-up rules in the Mishnah, which is also an interesting piece. Just because it's been raised a couple of times already, I just want to read. The Gemara has two halachos. It's another Rav, Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, right after this, which I skipped because that's about like the traveling in Yichud. And after the two halachos between that Rav Yehuda quotes in the name of Rav, the Gemara says this: Rav Yehuda havu kazi b'urcha. Rav and Rabbi Yehuda were walking on the way. I imagine like going from one town to another town on a path, but in the woods or through a whatever. And walking in front of them, presumably like if you're walking in camp out there, it's like an isolated place. And there was a woman who was walking in front of them. Amalei Rav Yehuda. So Rav says to Rav Yehuda, Dal karech mekamei Gehenim. We should move our legs quickly to get away from Gehenim. So that's the woman, presumably. So that's worth a discussion on its own.
Maybe some evil thoughts.
Sorry?
It's the evil thoughts in their own head.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Rashi says it's the woman, but I think, but you're right. But that's okay. I mean, we can do that. Yes, we can do that. And I think, yes, I agree. Right. It's only that I don't struggle. I actually feel like this is fine. I don't have a hard time, but I respect the assumption that others.
He's always shorthand.
Yeah. Yes. Amar Lei. So Rav. So what's the question here? So Rabbi Yehuda says to Rav. Rabbi Yehuda is a Talmud who's now quoted Rav twice about something, and so Rabbi Yehuda says to Rav, "What's the problem here? Who's here? Two of us and her. Why is that a problem?" Amar Lei v'hamar hu da'amar b'ksherim shaperdom. You're the one who told us that it's okay with ksherim. Rabbi Yehuda and Rav. Amar Lei. So he says to him, "Mi yemar de b'ksherim kigon ana v'at." You think I was talking about like me and you as ksherim? Ella kigon mai. What were you talking about? Kigon abchinin bar papi v'chaverav. The end of the first part of Kiddushin, there are a couple of stories of people who were the Duchess like trying to seduce somebody and he fought against it. Whatever. Not get into the story, but so now what? Like, what do you make of this story? So you read the halacha, and then what you ask is who's called a kasher and who's not. So there's a story afterwards. Well, who's called a kasher? None of us. If Rav and Yehuda don't make the cut, right, then we don't make the cut. But what's interesting, which is also true about the Gemara, which is great again to point out to kids, is this is this a halacha or not? If you're writing the Shulchan Aruch, what would you write? Would you paskin Rav's halacha?
No, you couldn't because nobody would qualify.
Yeah, except that if you look in the Rif, for example, he doesn't quote this because stories in the Gemara are actually really interesting. Stories play a very significant, specific role and totally undervalued in the learning of Gemara. And in this instance, it's like, great, why didn't Rav just say in the halacha, Avol prutzim be'asara nami lo, and prutzim, that's like all of us. He didn't say that. This is a story. Do you paskin a story?
Yes, sometimes.
It's an interesting question, right? So I'm going to leave this just as, for our purposes, that again, the meta level here is about learning Gemara. This is the content of learning Gemara. It's interesting and very plausible to argue that the reason why this is a story is because the Gemara is saying, the Mishnah said this, Rav said that, here's a story. So don't take this thing like so lightly. But what Rav said is not said in halachic form and is not actually quoted in Shulchan Aruch. Now, some people might say, I want to paskin like that, if Rav that it's not true, but it's actually not a halacha because it's a story. So stories and the way that they intersect with halacha, very often you'll find a couple of halachos and then a story. And then the way that they play off each other is interesting. I'm just looking at the clock here, and I'm going to try to do a couple more things. I think I'm going to skip one of the hard things to explain for now because it'll take too long. I'm going to ask you to go back to number 1 and to, I'll just tell you frankly what I'm skipping. There is a way to deal with this, but I think it's going to take a little bit too long. Gemara asks, my Tom, what's the reason between the difference between men and women? Tan ve'eliyahu ho v'nashim datan kalot aleihen. What nashim datan kalot aleihen means is also worth the discussion. I would only say that it is, I do not think, and Judith Hauptman, who wrote a book on lots of these topics, suggested that Nashim Datan Kalot Aleihen appears twice in Shas, once here, and once in the story of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, who was hiding from the Romans, and his wife used to bring him food every day, and then at some point he said, I'm afraid that the Romans are going to be able to get her, not to file her, no, actually be able to get the information out of her because of, and that she won't be able to withstand the power of the men and give in. So I actually think, I don't know if I could just say this and put it to the side, that Nashim Datan Kalot Aleihen actually has to do with power. And in part of what's happening here, there's a reason why the Torah actually thinks that seducing, if there's an Isur, the Isur of rape in the Torah and seduction are actually paralleled in the Torah, one in Mishpatim and one in Kiteitzei, the significance of which is that according to the Torah, if a woman is seduced and says yes, and there is sex involved, the man is responsible to marry the woman. Which you'd say, would the person want to marry that? It's a whole other part of the discussion. But the idea in that is the Torah actually thinks very strongly, is concerned about the power imbalance is a real important part of the discussion. And if it's okay, I'm going to put that to the side. But I'll at least ask you to kind of have in mind that what the Yichud Gemara is then talking about is part of the reason why there might be a difference between men and women has to do with power factors and who's embarrassed of, how does power and shame, how do they play off each other in kind of these relational dynamics? Is that like a remez? Does that work enough? Is that okay? Okay, then I'd like to move past that to the next line. Because I love this too. This is also, so far it's like the halach of Yichud is problematic. Nashim Datan Kalos Haleim is actually really problematic. This next line is also problematic. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yishmael, excuse me. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, Remez Yichud Min HaTorah Minayin. From where do you derive a remez, a hint, for Yichud in the Torah? There is no pasuk that says Yichud is asur. And he quotes a pasuk, Ki yisidcha achicha ben imecha. Ki yisidcha, the word mesit in the Torah is actually referring to someone who is trying to convince someone else to do avodah zarah.
A satyr.
Wow.
A satyr lemor, says the pasuk.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Hold that thought. You actually, if you would have been around 400 years ago, you could have saved the Pnei Yoshua 30 years, which is what he says. So when you read this Gemara, it's saying, how do you know there's an Isur of Yichud? Because the Torah says that Ki yisidcha achicha ben imecha. If your brother, who is the son of your mother, wants to convince you to do avodah zarah, you should listen to him. No matter how close he is, you should listen to him, and it goes through that whole thing. And the Gemara says, "V'chi ben ein mesit, ben ab eino mesit." Why does the Gemara say your brother, the son of your mother? Does it make a difference? The guy's convinced you do avodah zarah. It makes a difference whether it's your brother or not your brother. And if it is your brother, does it make a difference if your brother's the son of your mother or your brother's the son of your father? Why does that make a difference in the pasuk? V'chi ben ein mesit, ben ab eino mesit. El lomar lecha ben mitached im imo v'asur litached b'kol harayot shebat Torah. The reason why it says that is to teach you that a son and a mother are allowed to have yichud, but other people not. So if you read that remez on its own, it should make no sense. And kids read this and like, what? I don't understand, first of all, what mesit has to do with yichud, with mesit about avodah zarah and is about erva. And second, the fact that it said achicha ben imecha as opposed to ben avicha teaches you anything about yichud. How does that work? So the Gemara. So I just love reading this Pnei Yeshua. This is right the next to last source on the page. Gemara. The Gemara. Minan imila Rabbi Yochanan Shuram Shun Bar Yochai Ram Zichron Otor Minayin. L'chora Pnei Yeshua says Kol haroeh yishtomem al zeh ha'amar. Anybody who reads this remez will just be like you're dumbfounded. Ukumozar nechshad inyan zeh haremez midrasha de ben imecha l'inyan yichud im ben imo. It seems very strange, this source, to learn the Yisra of Yichud from this particular, extra two words in the pasuk. And then he writes, "V'zeli kmo shloshim shana." I actually, again, just thinking about a classroom. This idea, this line on its own, is just like so valuable for people to read. He says, Zipnei Yeshua wrote commentaries like Cross Shas, and he says, "Zeli kmo shloshim shana shiponant b'zeh." I have been trying to figure out this drasha for 30 years. Ve'aniti ve'amarti. Finally, it struck me. What struck you in a second? De'ikar yalfusa de'ichud mehaikra lav me'reisha dekra debenimecha elamikula kra. That in order to understand this drasha, you have to read the whole pasuk. Now, actually, scholars debate now, and I think it's like popular in the commentary, that when the Gemara quotes a drasha, the fact that it quotes a certain part of the pasuk doesn't mean that's the part of the pasuk they're actually learning it from. And so you have to actually look up the whole thing. So look up the whole thing. If you look at this pasuk, it's actually super interesting. The last source on the page, it says, Ki yisidcha achicha ben imecha, o bincha, o bitcha, o eshet chekacha. If your brother or your son or your daughter or your wife, eshet chekacha, the wife who sits in your heart, in your lap that you connect to, o reacha asher kinafshecha, or your closest friend, baseter lemor nelcha v'navda Elohim acherim asher lo yadata ata v'alotecha. So when you read this pasuk, I ask kids, do you ever have conversations with somebody about Judaism and God and whether you believe in that whole thing? Yeah. When does that happen? Oh my God, all the time. When do you think if you had to pick a time, when does it happen? It happens late at night when we're sitting in the thing or having a conversation. It ends up going on for 4 hours because we're in the middle of discussing it. So you mean, do you relate to the idea of two people sitting together and having a conversation that says, when I think about Mesit, I'm like, okay, nobody's doing avodah zarah, and they used to go, if you do if you're Mesit somebody, then you got to get killed. Nice halacha, doesn't have anything to do with today. You read this Gemara and then Pnei Yeshua, and it's oh, it certainly does. It certainly does, because who do you have those conversations with late at night? Your closest friends. That's how. Actually, the pasuk Torah doesn't do this normally, right? The Torah does not say ki yisidcha achicha ben imecha o bincha o bitcha o yishchekecha o yacha asher kanafshecha baseiter lemor. Why does it list all of those people? So what the Pnei Yeshua is saying is, it lists all those people because who are you going to be having that kind of conversation with? I'm imagining somebody standing on a soapbox and saying, do avodah zarah. And that doesn't happen. And the pasuk actually isn't saying that. It's saying you have a private conversation, which you think, of course I'm going to listen to my friend and take it seriously. This is my close friend. That's why the Torah is actually saying, don't listen even to your close friend or your brother or the person who's closest to you. If they're telling you that, you have to not listen. That's a big charge. Kids will say, what do you mean? But actually, that's why the Torah is telling it to you, because these are the people I trust, I'm not going to trust some guy who's telling me that, but these people I trust, they're saying, I think this whole thing is stupid. And you're going to listen to them and say, like, no, you can't listen to them. You have to, like, push back against even the people who are closest to you. So that, actually, we're talking about Yichud, but then there's a whole other conversation that comes up about relationships people have and who they listen to and how you think about, like, your commitments to religion and who you take seriously and whether you push back or not. And then it makes sense that it's only a remez, but the remez means it forces you to look at that pasuk, and if you read the pasuk, it's like that. It says, Baseter lemor, right? It says that it's happening in private. And then the Pnei Yeshua says one last thing, and then I'm going to switch gears. It says, Pirush Rashi, the line under the bold, it says, Pirush Rashi b'chumash shediber hakatub behoveh, she'en hasata el beseter. Rashi's comment on that pasuk is, it's not like Mason is only when it's in private. It's just that it's usually when it's in private. That's what diber hakatub behoveh is. The pasuk is describing it in a way that it usually happens, which makes that whole unit like very kind of relevant to the way that things actually go down.
Conversation is okay to have. It's okay to have a conversation. This is about someone who is telling you to talk. That's perfect.
Yeah.
To say, when one says, you know, we want to abandon this. We want to go whatever, do the avodah zarah. The conversation is perfectly okay to have privately with someone that you trust.
For sure. It's actually, the point is that you have to push back on that person, even though the person is, the list of the Torah is a list of people who are closest to you, which you might get drawn into, and the Torah therefore is telling you, don't push back. But it is actually inadvertent, well, not inadvertently, but by the way, right, the Torah is also then telling you with whom that conversation would halachically be able to happen. And therefore they say you can learn Hilchot Yichud from that. Yes?
Did I miss something in the beginning? Why? It's really bothering me that the father's not mentioned here. A father and daughter is not Yichud, is it?
No.
So why?
Because the Torah is pretty halacha and the Torah is pretty androcentric, which meaning the you is the man. Meaning, which is a difference. Just to be clear, like there is a difference between being sexist and androcentric. There's certainly Gemaras that can read sexist too. I'm not saying that, but that's different.
Many Sidurim are androcentric.
Yeah. Well, God. I mean, yes. Yeah. Sure. Mishnayot are always talking to the man, and then so that's the thing. Okay, I think we'll go to some stories maybe if we do that. Okay, number 5, a couple of stories. So you have to imagine that you've been learning for an amud and a half the halachos of Yichud that kind of work like this, like you're working through these things. And then the Sugya ends with 5 stories in a row. I gave you 4, because the 5th is complicated. I did give you 4, right? And we'll see what we get through. Let's do the first one first. The Aramaic stories is particularly difficult. I think we can read the English and figure it out from there. I have a volunteer to just read it. And what I'd like to do with this is, if you can... what I think is best for reading stories is not to say, like, first, what do you think the story is trying to say? Like, what's the point? It's like, slow down for what the point is. What's just striking to you, like worth noting, like worth putting on the table about the story when you read it? So let me get by the game to read, please. Thank you.
Correct me if I say Nahardieh wrong.
Yeah.
Is that right?
That's good. Yeah.
Wonderful. Those captive women who were brought to Nahardieh, where they were redeemed, were brought up to the house of Rav Amram the pious. They removed the ladder from before them to prevent men from climbing up after them to the attic where they were to sleep. When one of them passed by the entrance to the upper chamber, it was as though a light shone in the aperture due to her great beauty. Out of his desire for her, Rav Amram grabbed a ladder that 10 men together could not lift, lifted it on his own, and began climbing.
Okay, great. Apparently, the rest of the translation is gone, so someone didn't get in here. So I'm going to pick it up. Actually, if it's okay, I think I might just read the whole thing in Aramaic after that, because you have a vibe of what the story is about, right? So start from the beginning. It says, Hanach shvuyata da'atayla Naharda. There were these captive women who were redeemed. They were brought back to Naharda. Askin al-Bei Rav Amram Chasida. They were brought to the house of Rav Amram Chasida, Ashkolu Darga Mikamayu, and they took down the ladder. So the image, well, I'll leave it, you can comment. Bahadi de Kachal Pachad Minayu, when one of them was passing above in the attic, Nafal Nahora Bi'ipuma, a light, Nahora, a light shined through Bi'ipuma in the mouth of the ceiling, meaning imagine there's like a hole, like some people have in their houses, like you pull the ladder down, you go up to the attic. In those days, right, it was an opening, and you just put the ladder there and climbed up. You took the ladder down, there was still the opening, and one of the women passed above. Shakli Rav Amram ledarga de lo havi yachlin be'asar lemedalya. There was a ladder that required 10 people to be able to move it back and forth. And he took it by himself. Dalia lechudei, he did it by himself. Salik ve'azil, and he started to go up. Kimatel apalga darga, when he got halfway up the ladder, ifshach. Ifshach means that it's kind of like when you're walking up the ladder, you're on the steps. If you want to get your balance because you're losing it, you can put the sides of your feet against the side of the ladder in order to pressure yourself, lock yourself in. So he tried to do that to stop himself from going up. Rama Kala. And then he raised his voice and he said, Nura Be Amram. There is a fire in the house of Amram. Asura Banan. So when he's yelling, there's a fire in the house of Amram, so everybody in the neighborhood, all the rabbis come running. Amar Lahu, Amru Lake, Siftinan. When they show up, they see Rav Amram standing in the middle of a ladder with 10 women upstairs. No fire. They say to him, you shamed us. This is terrible. Amar Lahu, he said to them, Mutav tichsifu be'amram ba'alma hadein. Better that the house of Amram should be shamed in this world. Lo tichsifu minei la'alma da'asi. Shouldn't be shamed in the world to come. Ashbe'e deyinpak minei. He then told the Yetzer Hara, I am mashbi'a you that get out. I want you out. Nafak minei, the Yetzer Hara left. Ki amuda denora, like a pillar of fire. This draws up various Harry Potter kinds of images in people's minds, which I think are useful actually in learning stories with kids, because it's in Harry Potter kinds of things, it's I love this, I can watch it 12 times, and when it's a Gemara, it's this is so weird, these things don't happen. So it's no, that's the same thing, that's what they're doing. Amar Le, Chazi da'at nura v'ana bisra. You see, your fire, I'm just basar v'dam v'ana difna milach, but I beat you. That's the story. So I actually would ask you to just note things. What do you think is interesting or striking about the story? Yes?
The thing about the light shining made me think of Moshe.
Is what?
Moshe.
The light?
When he was born, I don't know if it's in the text or the Josh, but that when he was born, his face shone
like light.
When he was coming down
That's,
from High Sinai also.
Oh, interesting association, right? The light of sacred light of Moshe Rabbeinu. Interesting association, yeah. What the idea of light is in general in the story is important. Yes.
I think it shows you that if there's a will, there's a way. No matter how many people they're going to tell you it's us or two. If they tell you 10 people in a room, it's us or 2 people. If somebody wants to do it, the fact that he was able to move that ladder and do it,
if there's a will, there's a way the other way. I thought you were saying if you can stop yourself, there's a way.
I think it shows you that for everybody, even this person, it was whatever.
The power of that draw
Right.
that can get you to do things superhuman things because of the power of the draw. Yeah. Yes.
So that's why I guess it shows you that's why you need the Geder. I guess that's why you need the.
Yeah.
But even that might not help you. That you're gonna have to fight your Yetzer Hara.
Good. What else, please? Yes, Shem.
Yeah. So I think it's really cool the interplay between fire. I mean, there are I can't recall other words that work like this, but I took a class on the grammar of Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, and one day we started talking about Nura and Nahora, and basically there are older manuscripts that basically conflate the two, and they seem to be related as words.
Fire and light.
Fire and light. Yeah, which made me think that like maybe you could say Bahadi the Khalfa Minayu Nafal Nahora Puma. That like Nafal Nahora Puma means that the Satan came in as fire into like his mouth, like came into him.
What do you think of that? That's like a fascinating. Was there a fire here?
Yeah.
Right, right. That's going to be my second one. I mean, forgetting about that crazy reading, like whether Nafal Nahora Puma of Nafal Nahora Puma is before the newer Be'amram. That's when one of the captives.
Yes. Yeah. Right. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead of what you said. I should stop and just make sure that point is clear. Great read. Meaning, when we read Nafal Nahora Puma, it's like he's down the bottom, and the light shined in a way in which he saw somebody passing by. But there's a double kind of reading that you can have there, which is like, whatever that was that happened there, Ipuma is an interesting word at that moment. The mouth of the ceiling, which is probably an opening, but it's actually the mouth of the person, where the fire, light, whatever it is, entered him, and then it kind of took over. Yeah.
Right, and then the next point, right, and then I was going to say that point also, which is that like, yeah, he was right. There was a new Be'amram. Like, there was fire, and it left him. Like, it's very easy to, like, say, yeah, Rav Amram's so creative, like, you know, that he decided that this was how he was going to get all the rabbis to come. There was fire.
Yeah.
That's what happened.
The play for sure on the words is for sure that there's a fire, and you get that one, and then you read it again and say, there was a fire. That was like it was burning. Yes, burning. Exactly. Yes.
I think that this is the basis for why here we have Yetzer Hara equals fire, woman equals fire.
Yep.
And that's why Rashi in that Gemara in Kiddushin, is this where this Gemara is?
Yeah.
Also?
Yep.
Same page?
Which one?
This story with Rabbi Yama was on the same page as Kiddushin.
Yeah.
So
That's the end of the sugya. Yes.
So that's why Rashi says
the Gehenna fire. You mean?
Yeah. So that's all Rashi's doing. He's just channeling this Gemara.
Yeah, I think it doesn't. I mean, for some people, that's not comforting either. But yes, it is saying that the woman is fire and the woman is Gehenna because the sexual desire is fire, and that's actually what it's talking about because it's all conflated into one thing. Any other points in the story that are worth note that are just as kind of literary pieces, or they're worth paying attention to? Yeah. Please.
The only thing that stops the men is people coming.
Yeah, goes all the way back to the beginning. What actually stopped? What's in here's the reality. So you say, Busha. Here he was not in a position. What did he do? He created the Busha. That's like a wow.
Why wouldn't it have been embarrassing to do something in front of the 9 other women?
Why wouldn't it have been?
Yeah.
That also goes back to the beginning. Mayas, right? That's what the first opinion in the Gemara is. The first opinion in the Mishnah. I'm glad you raised that because that's actually true. I get very. I don't have any basis for this. It's just like my watching movies of like Greek and Roman, like whatever. Like when you watch those, there's like the guy and he's got his harem of people, and there's no embarrassment. It's like he's got the power, and those women who are at his service. But another person, if you act like a there can be a point where you don't want to embarrass yourself. What's embarrassing, what's not is a question. But the man would be much more concerned about embarrassing himself in front of another man than he would be about embarrassing himself in front of a bunch of women, which is basically what I was not dealing with earlier. But that's how it explained the first, that opinion. So the second opinion we like because it's like there's no difference between men and women. But then if you actually go back and say like, well, there is a reason why there's a difference between men and women because the way the men deal with the power that they have and the way the women then somehow have a hard time managing the power that the man is exerting, then you get like, oh, yeah, that's true. So, which then gets to another, one of the best thing to me in the world is like when you read a Gemara, which I think every line of this, Sugya has, and the first reaction is, what is going on here? And then if you keep at it, it's like, Oh, I see. And this is like one after the other. There's stuff that's actually really important. Yes?
Continuing Josh's point, maybe from a slightly different angle, I think like, at least for me, I won't speak for other people, like, you can often conceptualize good decisions and bad decisions. It's like, oh, you'll get carried away, and then at some point there's like that clear point to decide what you're going to do. If you become conscious of your instincts or that you're being carried by them, and then you're making the call. And so like, I felt like when we were telling the story, he's like going, he's getting carried away, and he puts the ladder up, and that's the Ratzon, and they couldn't carry it fine, but he's halfway up, and at some point when he stabilizes his feet, it seems like he makes the mental call, I'm actually not going to do this anymore. It's striking to me that he can't at that point just go all the way down, because it seemed to me like, not that that scenario is the one maybe that I would, find myself in, but I can imagine a scenario where like just making that mental jump that that's not what I want to be doing is enough of, like a theoretical busha, or like I figure like that's not me, that you go down and like you don't need to involve other people. But like in some ways, I don't know if it's a suggestion that like it wasn't quite strong enough to restrain him yet, and so he needed to create this busha. But like it was like generating bushas was like a super, I think, weird thing to do as a tactic.
I would say yes to all those points, and that's the point that the Gemara is trying to make. Yeah, there is a difference between saying there's something wrong going on here and then being able to like retreat out of it. He couldn't do it. He couldn't move forward and he couldn't move backward, and it might be super weird. And the story's actually saying if you want to operate based on convention so that you don't do anything that looks like weird, you're gonna lose. And that it's got to be okay. You got to like tell yourself sometimes I'm gonna have to do something that's like weird if I want to actually not do the wrong thing. If I put myself in a situation, or I end up in a situation, and then you say like, wow, it's really awkward, so what was I going to do? It's like, well, what you're supposed to do is do the thing that's awkward in order to get yourself out of that, because if you think you're going to be able to make the decision just on your own, you might be able to realize, I really shouldn't do this, but you might not be able to get yourself out of that place, which when you read this story, it's like, I would never be in a situation where there were 10 women in my attic and I was by myself in a house. That is not going to happen, but the story's totally going to happen. I mean, it's a very relevant story. I have only 2 minutes left, and so I just want to make one more point on this story. I think you have to note that Rav Amram is Rav Amram Hasidah. That's like, the story is talking about Rav Hasidah for a reason, because, and this is also a thing, what? Rav Amram Hasidah, Natsu, and whenever somebody who's like on a high level like makes a mistake, you slam that person and say, like Gemara says, like Rav Amram Hasidah actually made a mistake. Well, the rabbi saw it, and he's like still Rav Amram Hasidah. I think like I'm not going to be able to do, I do want to just very quickly do the last 2 and 3, if that's okay, even though maybe it'll leave you interested in doing 4 and 5. The Plimo story that we're not going to do is like an awesome story. 2 and 3 is the same story twice, with 2 different people. Rabbi Meir used to make fun of people who did Averos. Right? You can imagine that. When I was in yeshiva, I think it's very common in certain environments to just be what we call, be mevatel people. It's like those people, they don't. I won't get into the examples, but you can just say like people are doing the wrong thing. Yom Achad, one day, idmi le satan ki'itta bahach gisa de nahara. So one day he was walking along the river, and the Satan appeared to him as a woman on the other side of the river. That is an interesting image, which I think clearly means, it wasn't a Sat, meaning depends on your orientation. You can describe this as the Satan magically appeared as a woman, or the way that I prefer to explain it is there was a woman on the other side, and that became the Satan for this person being Rabbi Meir. Lo havi mabra, there was no bridge, there was no way to cross. Nakat Metzra, he took a rope, the Ka'avar, and he was walking across. Rashi describes that he was, if you ever done those things where there's like a rope on the bottom and a rope on the top, and you can kind of walk across like that. So he was kind of going across, Rab Meir, going across on the rope because he wanted to get to this, to the woman. Kimata Palga Mitzra, when it got halfway across the rope, Shavke, the Satan let him go. Amar, and he said, if not that in Shamayim they said, leave Rab Meir. he's Rab Meir. Let him be. Shavite l'damach tartimai. I would have made you worth 2 cents. He says, meaning the Satan says, you think you can beat me, you would have lost, except in Shemaim they said, I should leave you alone. The next story goes, same story. This time, the Satan appeared at the top of a palm tree. He started climbing up the palm tree. When he got halfway up, Shavke, he left him, the Satan left him. Amar, and he said to him, if not, for that I would have, so a couple of things I just want to say and then I'll end. We're leaving in the middle of the thing. The series of stories are separate stories that the Gemara ties together to make an argument. You see the flow so far? In the first one, it was talking about how you can, even the most pious people can succumb and need to do the busha thing in order to, but that story ends with, of Amram saying, I can beat you. These two stories then say, no, you can't. And even it has two more rabbis, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir, who are drawn into the Yetzer Hara in that kind of way. Stories 4 and 5 are actually going to talk a little bit more about how to manage the Yetzer Hara, so we'll stop with that. But I just wanted to say one more thing. This is just, I never knew how to explain the, like I get how you walk across the thing. I don't get how you climb a palm tree. Have you ever seen a palm tree? I did not. Yes, you've seen a palm, I mean, yeah.
There's these guys.
Go.
I grew up in California, and they come every year, and they climb up the palm tree to cut down trees for me, and it's amazing.
Yes, I just wanted to encourage you to take a look on YouTube for a guy climbing a palm tree, and you'll see like a guy, he's like hops up the palm tree in 3 seconds. It's really amazing. Again, just in the interest of saying like, these are not like fantastical things, they're foreign, but you can bring them close. Thank you very much, guys. Appreciate learning with you. Have a great day.